Welcome to the Allura installation how-to video series. Today we're going to be reviewing the general practices for installing fiber cement. When storing and handling fiber cement, it's important that you carry it on edge, and when you have it delivered that it's on flat ground, out of the mud and out of standing water. So when taking delivery of the product, it's important that you try not to bend it or damage it. In the old days, and with some lumber yards, they do it off a tilt bed and it bends the product. If you can get a service that has a Moffett, basically a forklift, or a boom truck, that would be the preferable way to place it. That allows you to put a unit on each side of the house and reduces some of the back and forth that causes extra time and labor. So when cutting fiber cement, it's important that you cut outdoors, that you wear proper protective equipment, that you use shears if possible, but if not, make sure you use a fiber cement blade to cut it. When you cut fiber cement, it's important that you cut it on the back side. The way the circular saws rotate through it, the way the shears work through it, you get a cleaner cut on the back side of it. So when I stack my material on my setup, I try to put it all upside down, and that means when I'm raining dust down, it rains down on the back side and I get a cleaner cut. It also allows me to crisscross my cuts when I notch and keeps me from having to whittle it out with a knife. When fastening Allura fiber cement, we recommend using a corrosion resistant fastener, stainless steel being on the best, a double hot dip nail, but we will accept electro galvanized, but don't recommend it. When you use the fiber cement, you have some choices: a roofing nail, a siding nail, a coil siding nail. Minimum 1 3/4 inch length for the most part. It's 1 1/4 embed into framing. That can include OSB or plywood. If you're using a non-structural substrate like gypsum, Celotex, any of the products that don't have holding power, you're going to have to be 1 1/4 inch into wood with a nail. With a screw, it's only 3/4 inch. So you take the minimum, add the thickness of the non-structural and the thickness of the product, and that's going to tell you your minimum length. So there's some fasteners you don't want to use, and that's because they don't work or we haven't tested them. Those fasteners are staples, work great for wood, not for fiber cement. A D-head nail, a clip nail, and that's because we haven't tested them. Aluminum nails, or gluing the product on. So in review, no staples, no aluminum nails, no D-clip nails, and no finish nails. The finish nails are only for our 1 inch and 3/4 inch stick trim products. So when you fasten, nail placement and screw placement is very key for a long-lasting Allura fiber cement job. The biggest mistakes we see when blind nailing, you do have 2 ways you can do it. Blind nailing is the preferred way to fasten the product. If you're using a 12-inch lap siding, do not blind nail it. You will have to face nail it. There's some positioning differences. With blind nailing, you're always going to be 1 inch from the top of the board, and with our 1 1/4 overlap for all the products, that covers up that nail. You're always going to have a combination of blind nailing and face nailing on every job. Underneath your windows, your last course, you're going to have to face nail. Those fasteners, you want to be 3/4 of an inch up from the bottom, and that allows that nail to go through both of the pieces of lap siding, and it gives enough thickness on the board below it at a 1/2 inch that it doesn't damage the board below it. So when blind nailing, 1 inch down. When face nailing, 3/4 of an inch up. When you're nailing the ends of the board and at the butt joints, it's very important that you're never closer than 3/8 to the end of the board. You're going to be 1 inch down, 3/8 of an inch minimum. In addition to nail placement, depth of drive is very important. We have tested all of our products with the nail proud to the surface, basically using the full 5/16 thickness of the lap siding. Anytime you flush out the nail, it does reduce the holding power. So for the best holding power, do not penetrate the nail into the board. We will allow you to flush it out, but it doesn't have the same holding power. Set your guns light, finish it off with a hammer, and you'll get a job that'll last 50 years. No job is going to be perfect because of the expansion and contraction. So you're going to have to periodically put in some additional nails, recaulk some boards. The fiber cement isn't moving as much as the structure. Just like everything, even fiber cement that has very low structural movement moves a little. So you need to make sure that after time and multiple seasons that you maintenance the product by adding additional fasteners and additional caulking as needed. We don't recommend face nailing the joints. if you've blind nailed it. There's going to be some instances where the framing is not very straight. Most of the time, if you nail a stud back, that's going to lay that board down without putting a nail right on that weak part of the board. The combination of blind nailing and face nailing, with that face nail being exposed on your weather walls, there's a good chance that can crack out at about 7 or 8 years. So avoid face nailing in combination with blind nailing unless you're using our 12-inch product, which we require to face nail all of it. We do have testing for just into plywood for SIPS walls. Structurally insulated panel system is basically foam with OSB or plywood sandwich to it. Because of half the embed, basically we require 1.25 inches. You only have a 1/2 inch, so it takes twice as many nails. So if I'm just attaching to plywood, I'm gonna need twice as many nails. Normally we're gonna be having a nail every 16 inches. With SIPS walls or just 2 structural sheathing attachment, you're gonna need to blind nail every 8 inches with 2 fasteners at the ends. Normally you'd be into framing and that secures the end of the board. With structural sheathing, it's gonna take 2 nails to make up for that 1 nail into a stud. The position is a little different. You're always gonna be 1 inch down, but you're gonna start 1 inch from the end of the board and 3 inches from the end of the board. So you're gonna have 2 inch space in between those 2 nails in the plywood, and that will make up for not hitting framing. When it comes to aesthetic pin back, you're gonna get some loose boards. I recommend using a coil siding nail, a smaller head nail, and periodically where the boards are loose to face nail those areas to get it to lay down when you're maintaining it. So when it comes to field joining of the products, unless you have walls that are 12 foot or less, there's going to be areas where you're going to have to put 2 pieces together. We do not recommend caulking those joints because the caulking manufacturers don't recommend it. It's impossible to keep that joint maintenance free. With that structural movement, eventually that caulking is going to need to be recaulked. In lieu of caulking, code says you can use one of 3 things: caulking, which we don't recommend, a strip of flashing, or an H joint. We recommend metal flashing, but we would accept 15-pound felt or any code approved flashing material behind those joints. It's generally going to be 6 inches wide, the width of the profile overlapping the piece below it about 3/4 to 1 inch, and that diverts any water that's in the joint onto the face of the piece below it. Moderate contact on that joint. You don't want to expose that flashing because you just don't want to see it. That flashing should be dark in color, 15-pound felt black, a brown, a gray. Even with pre-painted white siding, that crack shows up dark. It is never acceptable to leave a gap at that joint. Just like everything, people get shorter, things shrink. If you gap it and it shrinks, you're at an unacceptable gap. And it's more of an aesthetic thing, but because fiber cement doesn't expand and contract like most siding products, you can go moderate contact, never force them together, but you're not exposing that backflash into the UV. With that tight butt joint, you need to make sure you're leaving 1/8 of an inch on each end of that run of siding, minimum of 1/8 of an inch. If you're notching around windows or things that move a lot, I would probably go a 3/16 or a bigger gap, but a 1/8 minimum at dissimilar materials. Your corners, your window trims, your bottom of window trims. Above trims, we require flashing because building code requires flashing, and then a 1/4 inch gap so water doesn't get trapped in the wall assembly. So clearances are the biggest factor in reducing movement. So our clearances from the widest to the smallest are 6 inches out of the dirt. That's a building code, we didn't make that up. We have the lowest clearances of any fiber cement manufacturer at 1 inch. So we say 1 to 2 inches. Personally, as a siding contractor, I like 1.5 inches. That way I can put a 2x4 or 1.5 inch piece of wood. That helps me use as a gauge. 1 to 2 inches, you can go more than that, but never less than 1 inch unless you're in a covered area where you're not going to see any water. 6 inches out of the dirt, 1 to 2 inches off of roofs, porches, patios, anything that can pond snow or water. And when it comes to flashing, which is another building code, you want to make sure you have at least a 1/4 inch above that siding and the flashing, and that's where water doesn't bridge and allows water to escape the wall assembly, preventing rot and water damage. The biggest mistakes I see are not those 2 things or 3 things. It's the clearances from the side of windows where you're notching around. You must have a 1/8 of an inch minimum. Windows expand and contract at 1/8 of an inch morning, noon, and night. So make sure that when you're cutting around window heads, doors, hose bibs, light blocks, that you leave 1/8 of an inch on each side. When you're fitting in between windows, doors, I measure it tight and I take 1/4 inch off. That gives me 1/8 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch. When I started, I was a finished carpenter, so I cut everything tight. I had to cut everything 2 or 3 times. And if it's so tight that it can't move, you can't even level it up. So do yourself a favor, do not put in fiber cement tight to windows and doors. Make sure you leave 1/4 inch total, 1/8 of an inch on each side, and most importantly, 1/8 of an inch where you've notched around and thinned out the product. You need to allow for that expansion and contraction of that window, door, light block, and the push and pull, the structural movement of the sheathing around it. So in review, 6 inches out of the dirt, 1 to 2 inches off of roofs, porches, patios, 1/4 inch off of flashings, and do not caulk that, and then 1/8 of an inch between anything that's dissimilar, where you're buttoning the windows, doors, corner trims, where you're notching around windows. So when it comes to finishing fiber cement, always use 100% acrylic latex paint. You should never use the oil-based stain on fiber cement. The primer is a latex paint and they just don't work well. The caulking you should choose should meet a ASTM C920 and a Class 25 designation. The C920 is a ASTM for fiber cement. The Class 25 means that it shrinks and expands up to 25% of its width. OSI Quad and Tight Bond have a Class 50 product, which means that it expands and contracts up to 50% of its width. So we would recommend that you use equal or better to Class 25. The most important thing to get a good looking siding job isn't what the sider does, it's what the framer does. So make sure before you put your house wrap, your weatherproofing on there, that the wall is straight and free of imperfections. High nails, very common at where the seams are nailed together. So get your hammer out, pound everything flat, shim it out as necessary to get a nice straight wall, and the siding will mirror that nice straight wall. Allura would like to thank Mahar Homes for inviting us to their development here in Medford, Oregon today. Allura takes great pride in helping our customers with service after the sale, creating a world-class environment.